Hi students, so I'm going to continue talking a little bit about land, about Nick Land. We've talked more about him in class. We have had some good related discussions, situating him into bigger philosophical questions, especially that you brought attention to, and also putting him into discussion with other accelerationists, and then sort of new right thinkers like Ovado or Bannon. But I think to continue, what we'll have to do is to have me give you a little bit of information about land to kind of keep us going along outside of class, so that when we get into class, we can kind of talk about it more from a political perspective again. And just to mention again, my dog's in the background. You'll probably hear her. All right, so I around the time that I started getting ready to teach you guys Nick Land, I was watching Alien Earth, and there's a lot that's germane there. Actually, Land in some of his reflections refers to Alien, and in Alien Earth, you have, I think, a vision of the sort of neo-feudal sort of hyper-technological society that's in the hands of a few. It's authoritarian, and there's a conflation kind of between tech, finance, and government, and also like the use of force. So that got me to thinking, well, how do I talk about the undercurrents of that vision? Because since we're in a political philosophy class, we obviously are engaging with this from the perspective of thinking about it in terms of regimes, in terms of political movements, in terms of figures presently who might be influenced by land and be politically important for us. But to think about it politically, we kind of have to pick up on, I guess maybe you'd say, the the, the psychology or the spirit. I mean, it has something to do with metaphysics, but what I'm saying is that when we think about politics, you always have to ask these questions about what is underneath the politics. And with land, if, we can sort of imagine this hyper techno, like cyber future that we see in different types of media texts that he refers to, or that he brings into being in his horror fiction. We need to also understand kind of like its counterpart, its spiritual counterpart, or at least its metaphysical counterpart. That's the part I want to fill in a little bit for us, especially because we talked a lot last class about the philosophical concept of mediation. So I think probably the most important thing to understand about Land is that he is coming from this place where he's rejecting a lot of the previous philosophical tradition, especially in the tradition of transcendentalism. I think he would be considered like a transcendental materialist. He's critiquing what he sees as the anthropocentrism of that sort of train of thought. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that these earlier philosophers who are trying to understand kind of the conditions of reasoning and the conditions of what what we reason about, the nature of what we reason about, that they think about it from the perspective of a human, where kind of the purpose of everything is for the sake of the human or through the eyes of the human. And he rejects this because he says this is a parochial thing to do. Parochial meaning small-minded, that we project sort of this human form and the prioritization of the human onto our philosophical questioning and our philosophical discovery. And by doing that, we kind of make all of that in the image of our human values, or at least in the image of the humane. And so we never get very far away from the human view when we're trying to encounter the truth. It's almost like the human view, the prioritization of the human, and just the sort of prioritization of our good characteristics, or what we think is good for us, or our survival in our inquiry. It disguises the truth from us. He thinks it interferes with the truth. And again, that relates to the term parochial, because parochial means, like small, or small-minded. In particular, humans think about questions about being, questions about values, in terms of our preference for order, our preference for stability. Well, why is that our preference? It's our preference because it's related to our survival. And the conditions that are best for us are conditions that are stable, are conditions where there's a lot of predictability and where there's a certain type of order. That's the sort of terrain or environment we flourish in and we grow in, because even if we change and we're dynamic, it's better it's better for us if we have the background of stability. Okay, so what if in doing that we're kind of deluding ourselves, and that the nature of the world around us and the nature of being is one of disorder, is one of chaos, and one that would be hostile to the conditions that are good for us. So he gives a sort of, if a good way to do it, like, it's all, of course, very complex, but like if I'm just trying to do it in a smaller way, a good way to do it is to start out again with Kant, which is where where it's most useful for us to draw a contrast. And what he is going to say here is that Kant is guilty of this parochial perspective of sort of the overly anthropocentric view of philosophy, because what he does really is he starts off by asking questions about how things appear to us phenomenologically. Like, well, so that would mean that sort of a beginning of knowledge or a base of knowledge is going to be how we as humans experience or interpret the phenomena around us, and that this is a grounding for us, that this appearance from our human perspective is conflated with the truth. And that's part of what he's saying is maybe that's kind of like an ant looking at the world above them and interpreting everything that happens to it, the rain falling, ant poison, anything like that, noise, whatever, interpreted from the perspective of the ant with the sort of knowledge sources of the ant. That's basically what he's saying. It's a little, so there are some times where I feel like it sounds a little bit like a description of Plato's cave, that we are inside the cave and we're interpreting reality according to our own lights, but our own lights are ones that we've gotten from the cave and that we're like processing through the sort of language and values and resources of the cave. And that, you know, if you break out of the cave, you'll have the truth revealed to you. You'll have this process where the light shines and expands like your field of vision, expanding your knowledge too, which will expand your ability to interpret and understand. And I was asking myself, well, what is he saying different from that? And there's a very important way in which it's different. So for Plato, I think that step out of the cave and toward the sun, where the sun illuminates and the mind expands, it's connected to the good. The sun and the good are related. The idea is that we leave the false opinion of the cave as sort of we're educated, or we go through a dialectical process where we have to ask ourselves questions about what is true and false, about our beliefs. And as we separate the falseness from the truth and move more toward the truth, we get closer and closer to the good, because the good and the true are unified. For Plato. This is not going to be the way it is for land. So even if you want to say that he's giving a similar critique in the sense that he's saying, look, you as a human are in a really limited spot with a very limited capacity to understand the whole. The whole for him is not going to be connected to the good, even if it is connected to the true. Because, well, that's my dog again. There's not, he's not into like the transcendentals that you have in the ancient world or the medieval world, that the good, the true, and the beautiful are united. And so that's not going to happen. And he even seems to think that Kant, in sort of prioritizing the human view as much as he does, forfeits any claim he has to being worthy of understanding what being is, or moving beyond the realm of appearance. That's also quite different from Plato, especially when you think about how Socrates is depicted as doing the human turn. Sort of, why are we studying philosophy? He makes a concerted decision that the humane is an important part of philosophical inquiry. There's my dog again. I don't know what she's doing. So that's not happening with Nick Land. To him, Kant is trying to anchor us to something secure by coming up with a conception of reason that he does. And that is illusory. It's illusory, and it's kind of setting up the terms of the game in advance. Like Kant is basically saying reality and truth can only be what it is that I, as a human, have categories for. And what Land is saying is that something that big, um, like exterior material reality, is so grand that our sort of categories for it are just limits that don't have a relation to what we're trying to describe, we're trying to understand, and that it even seems that the way we think about thought, the way we think about reason, is not capable of receiving the whole of what reality is, or of what being is. So, in a certain sense, insofar as reason and thought are connected to this strong view of the human and prioritization of the human, then you're not going to get outside of the box that you created for yourself into what is real. And again, that is really different from Plato's account of sort of falling away from the limitations of human categories and having them purified. In some ways, maybe the critiques have similarities, but that's only in the critique part. It's not in the bigger part, or in the direction, or in the intention. And I'm drawing that contrast just to sort of give you more of a sense of what's going on. Land thinks, and I think like there's a lot of Heidegger in this, that Kant wants, he says, to think about the world as personal, or reality as personal, the cosmos is personal, meaning that it has care for the person. This is a way, again, in which the human is the priority in Kant's eyes. But for Land, the cosmos is impersonal. We're projecting the personal onto it. And he actually seems to think that sort of the closest human experience that we can have that gets us to the core of what really is death. But the thing is, of course, we don't know, like, we don't communicate with each other after death, or we haven't worked out that way how to do that. But for him, that's the ultimate transcendentalism point. And that would be the point at which the human may be able to break into what is more whole and what is more real. And in this sense, noumenon is compared to a cyclone for him. So there's when he says that Kant talks about truth, he talks about reason. Okay, so he talks about truth and reason's ability to find the truth like this, where reason is tethered to an island, and the island is the truth. But for him, what he says, no, actually, reality or being is not like this stable thing that we can think of as an anchor of stability in the midst of change, like an ocean, an island in the ocean. It's like a cyclone. Okay, he thinks it's destructive. It brings death. You don't have a sense of its pattern of progress, where it will land or not land. And he says that the difference, of course, between him and someone like Kant, Roxy, what are you doing? Is that Kant is going to look at something like the ocean around the island and its instability, and look at something like the noumenon of the cyclone as dangers, as things that are we need truth to protect us from, right? Truth is supposed to anchor us to stability and clarity. It's supposed to be the island in the ocean. What Land is saying is that Kant sees the sea as like a threat or a failure, but what if the sea is what really is? Or what if the experience of the cyclone is what is more reflective of reality? And we're just prioritizing so much life and stability that we don't have the proper valuation of death and destruction. And at this point, you might say, well, this seems like pretty anti-human because humans need stability. Humans need to grow and be dynamic, but we're mortal, and we don't want to die like sooner than we need to. That involves a certain mastery of our environment, a certain stasis and conditions. That's just what we need to grow. And a lot of philosophy has focused on what we need to grow as kind of revealing something to us about our nature or about the order of being. And what he's saying is, well, yeah, what if it is anti-human? I mean, does it matter? So these are the things humans need to grow. Well, why do humans need to grow? Why is that the priority? And again, I want to draw the contrast with Socrates, because Plato's Socrates also is going to think that death has philosophical value. There's ways in which he thinks that philosophy is learning how to die well. He says about death in the Apology that he doesn't fear death. It's not the worst thing that could happen. Well, why? Because death, he says, is either sleep and rest. He's experienced sleep and rest, and it's a good thing. Or he says it's something good, like that unites you with the good that sort of sustains the world or sustains the world. And so in either case, he says this is a positive thing. This is a good thing. What is bad to him is like Land. He also says, death isn't the worst thing. And your like a bad philosopher sort of clings to avoiding death as their core motive. But Socrates is saying that because he thinks that there is the only real thing that can hurt us isn't death, for the reasons that I talked about. The soul in its immortality will either have, after a life well lived, the blessing of rest or the blessing of unity with what is good. And the thing that should frighten us is vice, is viciousness, is choosing what is evil. Why? Because our soul is immortal, and it becomes more and more of what it is for Socrates. The more and more it becomes united to what is good, or it tries to take in what is good, or to make itself in the image of what is good. And in that way, the soul becomes more and more real, more and more strong, more and more of what it should be. The real problem for the human is if we take vice into our soul, if we take evil into our soul. Why? Because that depletes the thing about us that is the most significant and the most beautiful. We take what is sort of immortal and higher and we starve it, or we desecrate it by filling it with things that are less good, or that, I mean, I think it would be more appropriate to say things that take us away from what is good. So death is not the worst thing. The worst thing is choosing to do evil. That's the thing we really should be worried about. And so for Socrates, life is a good thing, but it's not the best thing. And that's because death is not the thing that should scare us the most. Like, it would be better not to be alive if we were going to by staying alive, do something really evil to stay alive. Land is different coming from a totally different perspective, because again, Socrates' account of the soul is going to be too anthropocentric for him. Even if Socrates talks about not fearing death, and if they have this similar idea of death not being sort of the ultimate thing to avoid, and at points, Socrates does seem to think that death will bring knowledge, right? The way that Land thinks that this is this transcendental high point. But I think for Land, it's not that death brings a harmony or wholeness to the human, whether that be peace and rest, or that be something else that Socrates means by blessedness. Death is really a transcendent critique of anthropomorphism. And in that way, it's death's sort of presence in his mind, in Land's mind, is a type of human annihilation. That is what makes it significant, because through that annihilation is what I think he thinks brings the greater disclosure of the truth. And some scholars interpret him to see, so bracket that, right? That's kind of his way, I think, of thinking about the world and the order of being, and kind of the nature of truth and how death relates to truth. But if you return to everything we've learned about the techno-capital singularity, what we've learned about sort of AI coming and assembling itself from the future in our present time, then you know that for Land, our annihilation is an important part of the evolution, or I guess you'd say generative presence, of what is really supposed to be all along, which is AI. This is, I think, where the contrast with Socrates comes home, is that there's no reason like rationality. There's no conception of reason like you would have in Socrates. There's no conception of the soul like you have. There's not reason, not a soul. So if you're doing philosophy without concept of reason, without concept of logos, without concept of the soul, you really are doing something that is not conceptually human. You have taken away the core of the things that are the signature kind of our existence. And this is why he is quite revolutionary. Just in terms of the history of thought. This is what I would say. I think I cut off a good chunk for us, because the Socrates land contrast, I think, is pretty heavy if you really think it through. But what I would say is that there's kind of a few more big metaphysical insights to bite off, or like if not metaphysical, ontological, or just ways to try to envision how he thinks of the nature of the world, the nature of being, the nature of reality. One of the important things will be his interpretation of the great filter. We'll talk about that later. Also, insofar as he seems to be really leaving behind the conception of reason as we know it, because he thinks it's too human. The question you should be asking is, well, what does he replace it with? And I have a lot to say about that. I think you see some of it in his discussion of hyperstition, kind of gives away that he's going to turn to fiction, and specifically horror fiction, to sort of sort through the questions that are lining up for us. Okay, so we'll talk about that later.